Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. My name is Asif Rahmani. If I've not met you before, so good to meet you right now. We are recording this webinar, and the recording for this webinar is going to go up on our site, which I should have actually brought it up over here, VisualSP.com. You'll see all the past webinars, and this webinar is going to be on Learning Hub and webinars, as well as we put the webinar recording on YouTube as well. You know, at any point in time, if you have also suggestions of other webinars that we can do in the future that would benefit you, your team, please let us know. We're here to provide good information and education to our audience. With me today is Eric Riz. I've known Eric for a very long time and love, chatting at conferences every time we meet. Unfortunately, we've not had any conferences in a while for obvious reasons, but hope to see you again, Eric, soon. No, that's the hope.
Thank you, sir. Great to be here and great to be with everybody. And certainly, yes, it would be wonderful to get the economies back going and real conferences happening again, hopefully sooner than later.
Absolutely. I think all of us hope the same thing. What I'm going to do over here is show you guys one quick thing, and then we'll go ahead and switch to Eric's presentation. As you know, Eric's presentation today is all about managing the communications mess. And I'm very much looking forward to it as well as to exactly what the presentation covers and how deep it's going to go. And I'm sure I'll have some questions. If you have questions, please put into the questions panel. Along the same lines, think about this, that we're currently trying to get the information, announcements, cautions or whatever else, the training, anything that we want to get to our users, to our employees as efficiently as possible so they actually see it. Because you can't just go to their cubicle, to their office, say, hey, Sam, did you read this? Or did you get that memo? You can't do that. So I just want to show you something quickly over here, and I'll do it on a communication site, regular SharePoint communication site, so you can see if you see a value for it, let us know. One of the things that is very apparent from this site is it's not branded at all currently. What I want to do as a business use case is I want to show an announcement on this site. Now, what I'm about to do right now can be done on SharePoint or any other site, actually. Any intranet, doesn't even have to be Microsoft intranet, could be any site. Now, what I want to do is in the top here, I want to show a banner announcement for people, something that's important to them. So I'm going to go to VisualSP. This is the VisualSP tab over here, which doesn't have to be shown, but currently is shown. Add a help item, and I'll choose banner. Banner is a type of a help item. We have many different type of help items. In the banner, I'll go ahead and just put some content in here. So actually I have something already written up. Let me just go ahead and grab that instead of typing everything, because I don't think you're gonna enjoy seeing me type everything. There we go. There's an announcement saying that we're here for you at during COVID 2019. I'm gonna go ahead and actually take this, make it bold, make it a little bit bigger. Here we go, maybe change the color to this green. And I wanna show this text to my users, maybe the first time they come to the intranet, to our communication site, or to wherever the site is, right? It's very important. In fact, I wanna also provide them some resources. And actually I pulled up some resources for working remotely, workplace mental health. I think this is a pretty good article. So I'll take that, copy it, go back here, and then I'll make this into a link, put the URL here, and I'll just show you a quick preview of what it looks like. Here we go. See this on top? So on this communication site, now this banner is going to appear and it's going to remain. It's not as intrusive, but it's enough that people will see it and they're like, okay, well, I should pay attention to this thing. And once they're done with it, obviously they can always exit out and that'll be it. And you can change the actual background where you want it to be, the text, all the good stuff like that. This kind of looks ugly, unfortunately, but I think you get the picture. There we go, a little bit better. So these kind of banners, announcement banners is what we're calling it. It makes getting through the clutter of email inboxes a lot easier, because now you're getting to them the information you need in their environment, which it could be the communication site like this, or a regular team site, or any kind of web browser based program, basically. So hope this is helpful. I'm going to go ahead and change the presenter to Eric to go from here. But if you have any questions for what I've shown you so far, let us know at visualsp.com if we can help and serve you guys. All right, so Eric, here we go. I can see your screen now.
Excellent, thank you very much. Thanks for that demo. Everything looks very good. And of course, it's great to be back here with you, Asif, and the team, and appreciate you offering the invitation to chat with everyone today. It's a very auspicious time to be talking about communication, certainly. And as organizations have worked so hard to try to design strategies and execute on those strategies for their internal communication standards, suddenly the world is put into a massive curveball, for lack of a better phrase. And the reality is people are realizing the types of holes they have in their organizations and within their communication and structure. So when Asif reached out and asked about doing a session today, the question wasn't which topic should I choose to do, but really how can I best turn this conversation into a real solution conversation, as opposed to just 50 or so minutes worth of content. So my hope today is that you will all find great value in this conversation, and certainly Asif and I, as mentioned, are here for all of you, and we hope that you will reach out and communicate with questions, comments, good or bad. We want to hear all of it, certainly. So please do. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't get some of the technology going today, so we have a little caricature of Eric instead of real Eric in video, but I'm certainly here in body as well as spirit, though I may not be here in video. The conversation today is really about standards. It's about looking at a scenario and a situation with Microsoft 365, SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, Yammer, Planner, and To-Do, and devising and creating some strategies for organizations to succeed. And what you'll soon see as we get into some of our content today is that this is really a twofold conversation. The first conversation speaks to the individual, and the second part of the conversation really speaks to the organization. Now, though the two have to operate at the same time and succinctly as an organism, as a machine, there are two very different perspectives that come with that conversation. As an individual, you communicate based on your background, your culture, the environment that you come from, the environment that you live in, and how you personally react to scenarios and situations. As an organization, organizations operate differently. They operate based on the bottom line. Their concerns may not be on the individual. They might be on the bottom line of the organization and ensuring that a certain number of widgets get created on a particular day or over a particular month. And certainly as we look at volumes in today's environment, that's a very critical piece of a conversation. So this conversation today is really based on creating strategies and tips for yourself and for your organizations that will really make a difference as you start to move forward. Now, a little bit of housekeeping as we move on here. You can certainly reach out to me at any time, eric@ericriz.com. Socially, as you can see up on the top right and below my image, or whatever image that might be, it sort of looks like me. Asif says it doesn't really look like me, but I think it looks like me. And the person that created it thought it looked like me. You can reach out to me on Instagram, Twitter, or whatnot, @RizInsights. And I do tweet out my own stuff there, so by all means, please reach out, DM me and whatnot. I'm more than happy to interact with you. Now, as we look at collaboration today, the collaboration landscape is changing daily, and more so daily now than ever before. The average worker is collaborating with more people, more often, and in more dynamic ways. They are increasingly mobile. They are increasingly working on a schedule that allows them to be most productive, but that level of production now has its own volume of complications, if you will. Most of us, if not all of us, are at home. I'm certainly at home. Asif, are you at home?
I am.
There you go. Two perfect examples. So we're 2 for 2 on our polls today. That's very good. And when you're working at home, of course, you have all sorts of other distractions, other environmental considerations to think about, not to mention the fact that each of us are in our own dynamic. Someone's dynamic might be a 600 square foot condo in the middle of New York City. Someone else may be on a ranch somewhere in a southern state and have all kinds of spatial capabilities at their whim. So it's really difficult today to understand what some of those cultural aspects that the people are forced into. And yet we all have to communicate in a professional manner. And more importantly, we need to know how to communicate and where to go to find that information. Now, obviously, the typical worker has seen several important collaboration changes in just the past few months. But for them, knowing when, where, and how to communicate is more important than the message itself. Statistically, workers are taking part in as many collaborative teams as they did 5 years ago. That's twice as many, collaborative teams as they did 5 years ago. The average information worker has seen the time spent on their day-to-day tasks increase by 50%. And we're realizing and recognizing that companies who are investing in collaboration and teamwork more than individual output and paperwork are 5 times more likely to be high performing. Now, the reason why you're seeing the image that you are about today's communicative landscape is really focused around the various methods that we use to communicate. So while some people may choose to communicate via a document, someone else may choose to communicate via text message. Someone else may actually pick up a phone, for those that recall what phones look like and how they operate. And someone else may decide to send a critical message through Twitter or other social constructs. And while we're very lucky with the number of methods we can use to communicate, we're actually at a disadvantage because no one frankly knows who or how a message is going to come through or how they should be expecting it. Asif and I are a great example of that today. We have no less than 10 different opportunities to communicate with one another today. But 5 minutes before our session this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are in the world, I sent a text message to Asif to say, "Hey, I'm online. Let's get this going. Excited to speak today." And his response was, "Who is this?" So we have a bit of a breakdown in our communication. Clearly, Asif and I don't text each other as much as we should. It's not because there's no love there, brother. It's just the way it is. But the reality is, if there's something that needs to happen on today's call or within today's communication with you, he's going to text me and make sure I'm aware of that message. So ensuring that we know how those messages are going to come through in a timely and efficient and effective manner is only one half of the battle. The other half is knowing which method to use in order to be effective and in order to communicate effectively. And while this conversation today is really focused on how to communicate and where and when to communicate, it's less focused on actual usage of technology. And it's less focused on usage of technology because, quite frankly, a message is a message. If you're going to send it via email, via text, via direct message, via Teams, via any chat product, the message is the same. Now, what that message contains, what it looks like, and how you may choose to send it is really based on the receiver. And that's really what today is going to talk about. Because as we look for our messaging today, and as we look to the ways that we communicate and the ways that we collaborate, there's so much context and so much content is focused around this opportunity that you see in front of you on big data. There's so much data, there's so much shared information, there's applied insights. There are ways to communicate and there are ways to receive communication. And that's truly our focal point because collaboration, as we know, spans zero organizational boundaries. And one of the issues that we have is knowing when or how to communicate information within our organization, externally, and then entirely externally to people that we don't know and likely have never met. And we'll talk about the ways that we can control those various methods as we communicate in today's conversation. We know as we go to the next slide here that the teams that we're working on are more and more globally distributed, and that workforce is increasingly diverse. As you look at this image of the various, or some of the various, I should say, some of the various icons or iconography that operate in today's technical space, certain images here drive specific thought and context to our conversational model. When you look at something like the Word logo on the right-hand side, obviously in the Microsoft context, Word means something to most of us. Most individuals, Word is a place where we go to write information, to author content. If we're super fancy, we might choose to bold some text, to italicize it, print it, save it, email it, and we're done. That's what Word's used for. And the average user actually only uses less than 4% of the functionality available in Word. Now, certainly Word wouldn't be looked at as a particularly communicative tool. But now with the advances over the past, let's call it 5 to 10 years, with co-authoring and the capabilities that people have to work together in a truly succinct way, looking at Word as a place where information goes may not be accurate. You may look at the SharePoint logo right in the middle of the screen as the place where you are collaborating, or the Teams logo in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen as the place where you are going to get your work done. One of the questions that I've been asked easily thousands of times over my career is, Eric, how will I know when SharePoint has been implemented correctly? How will I know when we're done? And my answer today in 2020 is the same as it was in 2001 when I first started using SharePoint. Back before it was called SharePoint, it was called Project Tahoe. And the way that you'll know when SharePoint has been implemented correctly and when you're done is when people use it within your organization to get their work done, not as a place where they go to simply find something or upload something. If you're using SharePoint or Microsoft Teams, to use two examples, as the place to get your job done and not just as a facilitation tool to do something else, then you're using it correctly and you're operating efficiently. And that, of course, is the end goal. That's the net that we want to get to. When Microsoft Word was the only tool that people were really using to communicate and using to produce content, there was an issue there because it was all based on the individual. It was based on their knowledge. So if you did something particularly fancy in 2003 with Microsoft Word, you're probably still doing it today, whatever that fancy thing might be. Maybe it's a mail merge, something super heavy duty from a process perspective. But as you look at how the information and the content is being used, what you also need to consider is that putting content into a word processing tool, which is of course what Word is, for those of you that remember what word processors really were, putting content into a word processor is very, very simple and very efficient. But now we have so many word processors at our fingertips, whether you're using Microsoft Teams to write a message, whether you're using OneNote to write a message, whether you're writing content directly into SharePoint, we have to be very careful with not just how we communicate and to whom we communicate, but where we put the communication itself. Because failure to have all those three elements lined up is frankly a failure to communicate. Now, to take that one step further, you also have a multi-generational workforce in front of you today. People who were using Word in 2003 on the far left were using Word in 2003. They may have been 30, 40, 50 years old. Now, 20 years later, almost 20 years later, those people have obviously aged 20 years, which means you're dealing with a different generation, now an older generation, and a workforce who in 2003 may have been 10 years old and are now 30 years old or 33 years old, depending on your math. That juxtaposition of individual, of learner, of communicator needs to be taken into account when you're looking at your communication strategy. And much like the way that Microsoft went through and redesigned all of their logos just a couple of years ago, there's a process that has to be realized here. And that's really what your greatest takeaway is from this conversation today. I'm not going to be able to, in a 40 or 50-minute webinar, teach you how to communicate, but I can teach you and talk with you about the things that you need to know in order to devise and create a strategy that makes sense for you and for your business. Because remember, as I said off the top, there are two different parties here, and understanding who I'm speaking to in the webinar context is just as important as understanding who you are speaking to from a communication corporate perspective.
Eric, you made some really good points, and a couple of things that stood out that I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm sure other people are thinking about it too, is there's multiple generations that you have to be talking to could be within the same company, often is the case. And there's so many different tools that you have to keep in mind as to where should I talk, not exactly how should I do it, but where. How do you make, you don't have to answer this question right now, but something to keep in mind for maybe later in the presentation to answer is how do you accommodate all those different things of different generations, different tools?
Absolutely. And I appreciate the question and thank you for that feedback. Obviously, there's no quick answer. You're going to have a very different set of tools and mechanisms that you need to devise in order to create something that is truly successful here. I think of my parents as an example. I won't divulge their ages in a public webinar, but obviously my parents are much older than I am, and I'm 42, which means they're not 42. And having a conversation with them about how to communicate just through text message, they're two very different dynamics. I might write an entire message to them about who knows what, how they're doing today, how they're feeling today in this strange world that we're in. And the response I might get is a thumbs up, because that's the way that they're using it, and they're excited about that. They feel like they're using text messaging, and that means something to them. But someone else who has parents who might be more technologically inclined may use the voice to text feature, hit a button, tell a whole story, hit send, and that person gets a very different response. So I think the short answer, and I'll address this a bit later as well, is the short answer is standardized training. Trying to get everybody within the organization to the same level of excellence, if you will, or the same understanding of how to communicate and what should be communicated, and also by extension, what shouldn't be communicated, is just as important. And we'll talk in a few minutes about what that really means from an email perspective, from a messaging perspective, a Teams perspective, looking at that inner loop, outer loop, external conversation. So looking at the communication realities, there were 182 senior managers interviewed by Harvard Business Review a couple of years ago. And they had questions and conversations about communication. And the conversations and the feedback were all about how do you communicate? What are the realities of communication? What are the inhibitors? What do you see as productive? What's a little bit deeper in terms of a thinking context? What do you see in terms of conflicts and things like that? And as you can see in the slide in front of you, 65% spoke to a lot of inhibitors in communication, where you look at distractions, crossover, people who weren't focused on the task and didn't spend the same level of effort creating the message. If you've ever done any type of communication or media training, you know that creating and crafting that message is really more important. So much so, I'll give you one of my favorite tips here, so much so that to successfully write an email and not fall into the greatest trap in email, you should write the entire body of the email, then write the subject, then enter in the to and CC and BCC at the top. Using that method, I will guarantee you will never send an email to the wrong person or the wrong message or without an attachment that you intended to send. So take that away with you if you're interested in that type of feedback.
Love it.
Looking at productivity, scheduling and scheduling communication, as well as focus and retention. We'll talk about retention in the next slide. Focus and retention is really critical. Having the ability to focus on the message and retain that knowledge, which few people are able to do, is very, very important. So much so that when you look at creating your communication strategy, one of the important things to consider is ensuring that you have less content in the message, not more content in the message. And that's one of the ways and areas where I've seen recently with a lot of clients, success in Microsoft Teams is based on three things. It's based on knowing where information should go, meaning which channel, which team, which project, so on and so forth. It's based on remembering that you need to be as transparent as possible because everybody in that organization, in that project, in that group is going to see that message. And remembering to keep your message succinct. One of the things I love about Microsoft Teams is that few people write in Teams the way they write emails outside of the organization. Now, if you've written an email or received an email outside of your organization with one line in it, hey, are you ready for the webinar, ? That typically comes with a lot of corporate standard around it. It may be preformed in a template with a hello greeting, and it will more than likely come with at least some sort of signature line. Thank you, Eric Riz. This is Mike Org. This is my title. This is my work location. This is my email address. This is my phone number. This is my fax number if you still use fax machines. Those are the little blinking things on the tables from years ago. You know, we have these huge signatures, and I've seen signatures with links and with legal disclaimers, and in the meantime, so much time and effort is wasted on the format of the email, and more of that time should be spent on the actual content. And that's one of the reasons why I love Teams, is that there is no, Microsoft Teams, I should say, pardon me, is that there's no preamble. There's no need to get to that level of depth of basically nonsense. I mean, you have people internally who are writing emails to the person in the cubicle or office next to them who clearly know and understand who they are in the organization, and yet all that content is just regurgitated time and time again. We're better than that. We can get past that. And my hope is that this conversation and webinar today will be the first step or the first rung on the ladder to that success for you. We know there's a lot of team conflict. We don't have to go too far into that particular conversation today. Conflict is something that is everywhere and rampant within society and within our project teams, and hopefully we'll get to a better place with communication as time goes on. And certainly using the examples of Microsoft Teams and some of the automated workflow pieces that I'll be showing you in a few slides may help with that, because it takes the personal individual personalities out of the conversation and it leaves it up to the content, and that's really what's important. Now, when we look to the retention dynamics, there's something called the forgetting curve, which is actually a German psychologist in 1885 who came up with this. And he said that up to 79%, so let's round it to 80% of knowledge is lost within the first month after it's acquired. That means that the ability to create the right communication environment is really ours to achieve and to accomplish. We have the capability to put the standards and methods and methodologies in place in order to succeed with retention, putting the information and the content that we need that is critical to us in places where we will see it over and over and over again if we have to. And that's really what needs to be done in order for us to achieve and succeed as a corporation. As an individual, people need to understand how they should be communicating, why, and more importantly, what they should be communicating. So if you think of yourself on a communication journey, and I spoke about this a few minutes ago when I was talking about Asif and I connecting prior to the conversation today, the communication journey is a very difficult place to live at. It's a journey with hopefully a beginning, a middle, and an ending, like any good story. But our reality is there are so many ways for us to communicate that we really have lost, and we can't see the forest through the proverbial trees. So when we look at how to communicate or what to communicate with, we have Outlook, Skype, Teams, Yammer, Slack, texting, Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp, just as a handful of examples of ways to communicate. And let's not forget that so many of these that you're seeing on screen right now are multifaceted, multifunctional. You can tweet at me on Twitter. For those of you who are on Twitter, you see my handle at the top right, @RizInsights. send me a message, tweet at me. I'll get notified on my phone, on my desktop, everywhere I possibly can get notified that somebody has tweeted at me, and I will see that message. Twitter will make sure that I have the capability to see that message. But now if we both follow each other, the ability to follow each other means that you can actually send me a direct message as well. So all of a sudden we have just a few examples between Twitter, Instagram, Microsoft Teams for various ways to connect, collaborate, and communicate just within those particular tool sets. Whereas Outlook, by and large, is a one-to-one communication facility. You send email, you read email, you receive email. That's what Outlook is there for. But when you get into some of the more personal environments and environments that are really driven by the user, there are all sorts of questions as to how and why people should be communicating and which methods they should be using. Certainly from a corporate perspective, Outlook, email, that's your formal way to communicate. That's the way that most people communicate, certainly at a formal level. But once you get a bit deeper, you may find that it's easier to text. I can probably do personally half of my work on a daily basis from my phone. Between texting capabilities, to Twitter capabilities, to Instagram capabilities, to Microsoft Teams capabilities, I could easily do half my work on a daily basis just from my phone. And that is part of the issue here, because people don't know how to communicate and why to communicate and which method to use in order to communicate. Certainly, I would be much faster if I was sitting behind my laptop typing on my keyboard than I would be if I'm using my thumbs on my phone. However, if I was using the voice to text, I could be just as fast, arguably. So all of a sudden you have a mental, cultural question of, well, what would actually make me faster as a communicator? My answer personally would be typing, because no matter how fast I can speak, I'm relying on the technology that's enabled in my phone to keep up with my voice and send the right message and text the right message. So we go back to our general constructs of communication. Now, when it comes to communication, one of the things we have to be aware of is people really like to waste time. And it's very hard to be quantitative and calculated around how much time it takes us to do something. How long does it take you to write an email? How long does it take you to read and respond to an email? Well, if it's 2 or 3 lines, it might be very quick. If it's 4 or 5 lines or 4 or 5 paragraphs, and it's a very detailed message, it may take me a couple of hours or even a couple of days to write it, depending on how I decide to write it and at what time of my day I might decide to write it. I personally write better late at night than I do first thing in the morning. Don't ask me why. It may be all the coffee that I drink. I don't know. But it's something that I've learned about myself as the years have gone by. So looking at this from a wasting time perspective, there was, and this is really an awareness conversation, there was something that was done in a salary.com survey where 89% of respondents admitted to wasting time every day at work. And as you can see from some of the figures there are some very concerning numbers. When an individual might be expected to work a 7.5 or 8 hour day, if they're burning at least an hour, at least a half an hour, some of them burning 2 hours a day doing things, well, why is that happening? And certainly from a job satisfaction perspective, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, because I'm not HR and I'm not about satisfaction within the individual organizations that we're talking to today. However, I do want you to be cognizant and mindful that the overall amount of time that it takes us to communicate can be improved, and we can look at communication differently. And certainly, as busy as we all are today, there is a lot of time that is wasted that we can leverage in order to communicate better. Now, back in 2017, there was an image, and there was a conversation that happened at Microsoft Ignite in Orlando, which was driven initially by Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, which is all about where to start a conversation. And there was this concept of the inner loop, the outer loop, and then email. And this is where we're going to spend the next few minutes in our discussion today. Now, the inner loop is, as far as this conversation goes, Microsoft Teams. The outer loop, again within this slide, is Yammer. I push that one step further and say that would be, today it could be seen as public channels within Microsoft Teams, where the inner loop might be private channels with Microsoft Teams. Who knows? It's really up to your organizations, and it really depends on the way that you structure this. But certainly from a communication perspective, the hub of most businesses today is Microsoft Teams, and you have the flexibility and capability to create the loops that make sense to your organization. Now, regardless of whether you are interlooping, which means connecting with people on a one-to-one, you want to make sure that you have the right people in that conversation, and you want to make sure that people are as comfortable and flexible with the information going back and forth as you are. And that's really something that's within the organization. Looking at the outer loop, people who are not internal to the organization necessarily, they might be contractors. I worked with a company recently where they had about half of their organization as contractors. By that I mean external parties, not people who are on a contract to be quote unquote employees, but external parties who are treated as teams, meaning within their internal teams, and they were treated as internal folks, which meant that they needed the same level of access as all of their internal employees. So we have to look at this slide and this conversation as something that can be suited and customized based on the organization. But the one thing that I'm very, very straightforward on, and the one thing that I am very passionate about, is the fact that email should only be used for completely external parties, external to the organization, unless of course there's a reason to do so. So people who are entirely external, it could be someone like, depending on who you are within the organization, if you were trying to outsource a particular function, let's say it's HR, let's say it's security, physical security for your business, that's something that might be done through email, and certainly you have no control over who sends you messages to your email box. But email is something that should be used completely externally to the organization. And that's one of the best ways to strategically get a real handle on the information that's coming in and out of your organization.
Oh, these are really good points that you're making, Eric. And I really like the fact that you mentioned that this was 100% true, or I don't think you said that specifically, but it was true in 2017. Now, as you mentioned, the outer loop could be within Teams, inner loop could be within Teams. So it's very much dependent on your needs as a business. You don't have to go off of exactly the prescribed method of what Microsoft is saying here. Work for what works best for your company.
100% correct. Now, going into the next slide, and one of the reasons why I brought this slide in and I cite it as Ignite 2017 is it's a construct. It's something that can be used as a foundation within your organization, regardless of how you decide to use it and leverage it going forward. But it's something that I want to show because I find that so much of our conversations today, as far as technology goes, as far as process-driven organizations go, is so focused on the now, so focused on what we do on a day in, day out basis. And a lot of people, companies, and organizations forget to go back to, hey, how and why did we create this from the beginning? What was the thought process to creating this back in 2017 or 2018? And this slide really is that level of foundation that gets us to where we are today. And knowing, as I said previously, where to communicate is super important. So if you're looking at something like Yammer, when should you communicate to Yammer? When should you communicate within Yammer? And for anybody who's seen the Yammer tab within Microsoft Teams, it's pretty slick. If you haven't, you should. But Yammer is really used for corporate messaging. You're looking at something that is 10,000 people or more, messages that are looking in today's environment, based more on the organization and emergency preparedness or feedback and recognition than anything else. Those are general messages that are written without specific people or specific purpose in mind. They're made as FYI messages or things you should be aware of, as opposed to specific logo functional project related conversations or messages. So looking at the second option here, you see Microsoft Teams. Microsoft Teams is used for 2 to 50 people. It is only local. It is only within channels and teams, if you're familiar with it, as I'm sure most of the people in the conversation today are. And those discussions are project or task related. And part of the reason why I have that particular bullet there is because, as I was saying a few slides ago, because you're dealing within the same project or task, you lose the preamble, or you can lose the preamble. You don't have to put all that time and effort into driving and creating content for, hey, how are you? Hope you're well. I've seen so many emails over the past week which say, assume this message reaches you healthy and well, or something of the sort. You know, at a point, if you continually see the same messages over and over again, you reach this common denominator of useless. And those messages now are frankly useless. They were at a point in time nice to see, you know, good to see that somebody else had your back, but today they're not really functional and they're no longer important to the message itself, which means that somebody may subconsciously be losing credibility as a communicator just by sending you that message. So the subconscious here has a place as well. And then finally, Office 365 groups. Well, this is where you would be using discrete email messages, individual follow-ups. This is where you're going back to your email conversations. So knowing when and where and how to send those messages, of course, is very important. As we look at where to work, where you're working is as follows. When you look at something like Yammer, at Microsoft Teams, at email-based or Office 365 groups, you're looking at Yammer as really working in public. You want maximum transparency, you're cross-departmental, you have your participants in the conversation as really generic, almost, not to throw any rude curveballs in there, but really it's just generic conversation or information that you're sending. Working in private, well, if you're working in private, you're in teams. You're functional, you're speaking to and communicating with your direct reports, with your team members, and you're providing specific internal detail within your Microsoft Teams conversations and messages. And working in private, again, going back to email, those are one-to-one connections. That's when you are interdepartmental. It's when you're sending information between two people that's really relevant and frankly not for external eyes. So again, things that are perhaps financial related, HR related, those are the things that may go one-to-one depending on the nature of that information. Now, creating goals and time management and communication change is where we're going to spend our next few minutes. And then we'll wrap up shortly after, probably about 10 minutes from now, and make sure there's an opportunity to ask any questions. I can see there are not any yet, so if you have some, by all means, please go to the questions tab and put your questions in there so we can provide the feedback that you are specifically looking for. Now, creating communication goals is really something that is obviously a personal construct, and it's something that organizations will push and drive you to, but it's really something that you have to figure out a way and a process that works for you. Looking at behavioral change, you need to assess and eliminate the things that waste time within your schedule. You, quite frankly, need to be ruthless with your time. Our time is pulled in so many different directions today, especially around communication. You need to be ruthless, and I'll show you that in a few slides as well. Being ruthless means you have more time to manage what's important. You know what's important. You know what you have to get done on a day in, day out basis. No one has to tell you that. So being more effective with time and having that wasteful assessment is very critical. And then testing models to identify what works for you. What works for me and what works for Asif are two different things, and what works for everybody on this call will be different things as well. You want to make sure that you take the time to test out some models to identify the things that might work for you and spend some time doing it. Spend a week doing something a particular way and see how that works for you. If it works well, great, adopt it. But if it doesn't, don't be afraid to try again and try something new or different. Then on the right side of your screen, talking about setting goals, removing time wasters. Those are emails, phone calls, text messages, notifications, or as I call them, distractifications, which they frankly are. Trying different things and then figuring out what works for you. There was a Harvard Business Review study that was done years ago, which said that if you are truly focused on a particular task that you are doing and someone knocks on your door to talk about something that's insignificant, like the score in a game last night, or whether or not you saw the new car that somebody got parked in the parking lot, it will take you between 10 and 15 minutes to reset your mind and refocus on the task at hand, which means net, if there are 60 minutes in an hour, excuse me, not 60 hours in a minute, but if there are 60 minutes in an hour, net in a 60-minute hour, you are actually at a loss for the overall time you have to get things done and refocus and get your tasks complete. And that might mean something as simple as closing your door, as turning your Teams notifications or your email notifications to busy or to away. Who knows? There are lots of strategies that can work for you, but it's up to all of us to identify what those are and look at deploying strategies that work for us. Using time management from a scheduling perspective is equally important. It's looking at visualizing what you need to get done, ensuring that you're measuring and targeting things to ensure that you are on target with the work that you need to get complete. Looking at the time that you have on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to get that done, and then identifying what the value and cost of time really is. Everyone knows that, especially in professional practices like legal, accounting, and whatnot, time is money. And the more time you invest or spend on a particular task, the less you have for others. Communication is very similar. Ensuring that you're communicating effectively and assigning value to cost or value of cost to your messages is a very good way of identifying what matters to you and how best to succeed within communication. At the same time, understanding what communication really means and really is a very important thing to an organization. You need to understand that there are various stages and various methods to consider within communication. And this as a scale is what things will look like from stage one, where there's that sort of ending scale, hopefully no depression, but almost denial, shock, growth into acceptance around empathy for systems you may be deploying, something like Microsoft Teams. If you were putting in particular strategies that meant people were going to be less responsible and dependent in using Microsoft Outlook and expected to use Microsoft Teams, people might be shocked. Somebody who's been with the organization for 40 years doing things a certain way with email, who has to think about what they've had to learn within communication over those years, over those 40 years, to now say that they have to communicate differently with a different platform in a different way may be something that takes a bit of shock and denial in order to move into the acceptance curve. And then eventually, as you move through transitioning, through experimenting, decision-making, and engagement, you move into and towards those new beginnings. So as an organization, certainly the psychological aspect of things will really make a difference. And as we stand here in May of 2020, this will be looked at as a very auspicious time in our world. And the way that we, as a culture, as a community, as a very broad and diverse community, the way that we react to this time period and how we succeed as organizations through communication and the way that we operate will really be telling of how this economy does over the next coming years. So keeping this slide in mind may be something that you want to do and keep it top of mind as you move forward. I mentioned prioritizing ruthlessly previously. This is something that I do. I'm not sure that I do it well, but it's something that I do. I break my tasks up into 3 time-sensitive communicative ways, which is now, later, and never. What do I have to do right now? Who do I have to communicate with right now? And what am I going to do to achieve that for myself and with my organization? What can I do later? What might be non-critical or something that I can assign to somebody else within the organization? Something that can be completed at a later date or time, perhaps. I'm very bad with deadlines. The joke here is, of course, that deadlines make a very strange sound as they go flying by. So if, for example, I was invited to speak at a conference, which happens quite often, which is fantastic, there's always a deadline for submissions. And also, if you can back me up on it, certainly. I know I can hear you laughing because we all do the same thing. We see a call for speakers come out, and we note that it's due in 2 weeks. So I, for one, if it's due on a Friday, will put a note in my calendar for Thursday to pick it up and review it. Of course, that isn't the right thing to do necessarily, but I've time blocked it, and I've put time constructs around it to ensure that I can assign that to myself and get that done when it needs to be done. So now, later, and never. And then on the never side of things, looking at things that can be delegated, or quite frankly, if it's spam offering me some incredible value add service, which I've never had before in my life, I may delete it and never respond to it. And of course, we all know what I'm referring to there. We talked a lot about communication today, and there's a lot to be said on success and failure with communication from an individual level, what to say, how it should be said. I'm going to jump over this slide today, but certainly you'll have the ability to go and view these slides following the webinar today. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can email me, eric@ericriz.com, or hit my website, my blog at ericriz.com. I'll be happy to provide them to you. But as we look at a couple of things, I want to discuss creating an email schedule. Now, most people sit with email and Outlook open on a daily basis, minute by minute, hour by hour. And remember what I had said a few minutes ago about the distractifications in our world. Those notifications that pop up to say that something has come in your inbox, not important. They only distract you. So checking your inbox, believe it or not, 3 to 4 times a day. Remember, if you're creating a structure that's external email only, hopefully, there's a very good strategy to deploy there around when to work, when to read, when to respond, and how to set up our day to succeed there. So utilizing templates, utilizing drafts, delaying long emails, looking at best practices or standardized responses are all ways you can help yourself and assist with your best practices and getting to the right place within communication management. Now, on the previous slide, you saw Power Automate. Power Automate, which I imagine you all have access to, is an out-of-box flow-based, used to be called Microsoft Flow. It's a flow-based tool that exists to make you stronger, better, faster. It exists to make you procedurally efficient and automate some of the things that can be done on a day in, day out basis for you. It is free. It's already in your tenants. And just to give you an example, I grabbed a quick screenshot before today's conversation, which shows you just a few of the email-enabled Power Automate or Flow pieces that are online and available to you. And one of the interesting things here to me is this number here on the right-hand side of each of the cards shows you the number of times it's been deployed and downloaded. So just under 450,000 people have picked up this particular piece of functionality, which you can integrate very easily. It's a no-code solution. If you know what you're doing, it's very easy to deploy, which simply saves Office 365 email attachments to OneDrive for Business. That's something that most people do anyway. You right-click, you save something. It's a great time saver, and it's a great way for you to free up some more time in your day and be able to be as ruthless as I had mentioned earlier. So take a look at Power Automate if you haven't already. Looking from an organizational perspective at the tools and systems that you need to organize, well, I'm not sure when we'll next be able to do this, but have meetings and have conversations that make sense at a corporate level to your organization. Look at utilization as a business, look at tools and system reviews that make sense as the organization gets back together, and now is a very good time to do that. feedback systems, review and cycle, and discussions and delegation that really make sense for your organization. Remembering, of course, that as you look to support your business and tailor your business solutions to your needs, as you look to have better conversations and create communication and structure within technology that makes sense for you, there are 4 ways of doing it. There's toolkits, facilitation, workshops, and consulting. Examples of each are below. At the end of the day, only you can look at yourself and your organization and assess what makes sense to you and what you can do in order to succeed. It might be a toolkit. It might be putting a toolkit, some procedures, standards, and processes online within a centralized center of excellence location internally that everyone has access to, which will allow people to get to where they want to be or where the organization wants them to be. It might be facilitation, a little bit of support, a little bit of hand-holding, if you will, depending on the type of organization you're coming from. It may be something like a workshop, or maybe going external and going and looking for a consultant who might be able to help you out. Whatever it is that you are doing within the various constructs, there's all sorts of help out there to further support you. On the consulting side, I actually saw a website over the weekend, which was called simplifiedteams.com. And that's a website that has a number of downloadable templates and fulsome documents specifically within Microsoft Teams for people to leverage and use. I thought that was great. Now, finally, in our summary, before we go into the laundry list of questions that we have here in our few minutes left, in summary, start within. Understanding and managing the communication that you live with and the communication that you need to build as a construct and build for yourself is really something that you have to identify first. So let's make sure that you manage your communication inward and outward first. Second, look at the tools and techniques that you are required to use and you should be using to support yourself. And then third and finally, creating a personal roadmap to success, specifically within communication, is a strong recommendation for a takeaway and things you should be doing for yourself, specifically within communication and trying to manage this communication mess. Our final slide, just my name and contact details. As mentioned, eric@ericris.com. If you'd like the slides, let me know. On Twitter, as I see we're blowing up Twitter now, at Riz Insights on Twitter and Instagram, please reach out. And then finally, my favorite question, how can I help? Please let me know that as well. Asif, sir, over to you.
Wonderful stuff. There's so much stuff that I even got out of it. I've been taking notes. One of my favorite words that I've never heard before, but it makes total sense. Distractification. So true. So true. Absolutely. And there's so many questions that I wanted to ask you myself, Eric, but I'm going to go with some of the folks who are asking questions. There's a couple out there, and others. If you guys have questions, please put them on. Even if we're not able to get to them, I'll send them to Eric, and then maybe he'll respond to you directly.
He will.
Yeah, awesome. So Diane is asking, this is a long one, I'm going to go ahead and read it, and the question is at the end. I love the concept of categorizing when to use one communication method versus another. How do you address the contract worker aspect? So they're not employees, not privy to same communications, yet often they are left out of critical communications that applies to everyone, such as office is closed, something that applies really well right now. So I understand the legal HR differences needed due to contract versus employee workers, but the overall communication side is a frequent source of missed communications as quote unquote rules override the need to know. How do you recommend organizations address this issue?
Wow, I'll give you a lot of credit there. Asif, you definitely pulled one out of there that's going to take the longest amount of time to answer. I would say that, I mean, certainly it's a very difficult answer. I would say that looking at the 2 different ways to communicate and identifying standards that are really focused around the message you're trying to get to the contractor is of greatest importance. I think if you're asking, I don't know if maybe we can get some live feedback here, but if you're asking from a now perspective, from a COVID perspective, I think now is a time where the more information you're able to provide, the better. If you're not dealing with information that is mission critical or or security information to the organization, then I would provide as much information and treat your contractors as employees as best possible. If you're sort of stuck within the mantra of I can only say so much to my contractors or my third parties, that's okay. You may want to open the kimono a little bit to provide them more feedback, more insights, but having 3, 4, 5, depending on the message you're sending, 3, 4, or 5 different pieces of information written in different contexts may help you, where you can basically drag and drop the appropriate message almost the way you would in a legal contract to buy a home. If you're familiar with an agreement of purchase and sale, lawyers don't go and just write everything from scratch unless you have a really bad lawyer. But lawyers will go to a bank of clauses and pull the clauses out of that particular verbiage bank that makes sense to that contract. And my encouragement would be for an organization to do the same thing. Have similar things written to the various parties you may be speaking to, and ensure that you're pulling information out to the people that are needed and relevant.
Yeah, this is really good. And I just want to say that Diane actually responded back as live feedback, as you were saying, sorry for the long question, but as a OCM consultant myself, that I'm usually contract. So I run into this all the time, and then there's more as well. But yeah, and
So
Diane has provided, go ahead.
that's interesting, Diane, because you're I didn't really qualify the question. I assumed based on your question that you were not the contractor, you were the company. So now if you're the contractor, that's a different level of communication, because this is really based off of your contract and what the organization has to provide you, but also the questions you ask and the level of feedback that you're expecting to get.
Absolutely.
So Diane, email me and we'll talk more.
Marianne also is saying that she's run into the same thing as well. And actually, Diane has provided her email address, so I'll get that to you.
Thank you, sir.
I know we're a couple of minutes over here, so I'm going to wrap up here, but there's a couple other questions that have been put out there. I'll go ahead and send them to Eric, and Eric can go ahead and respond to them as he said he would. Eric, I want to thank you very much for doing this thing. There's been a lot of good information, great information, actually. I was able to learn a lot of stuff as well. As I was saying before that, I put a lot of notes together. Folks, if you want to reach out to Eric, his information is right there. Please do. I think you're going to get a lot out of that conversation. And I'm going to go ahead and say this. I know everybody's saying it these days, but I think it's still worth saying that I really hope that everyone is staying well out there and staying safe. If there's anything that we can do as a company, or I'm sure if Eric feels the same way that he can do, please reach out to us and let us know. A bunch of us who have been around this technology for a long, long time do know certain secrets and ways into how you can make things better for your users, for your employees, especially now in the remote worker stage that we're all find ourselves in. So please don't hesitate and reach out. We'll help if we can. All right. Well, thanks very much once again, Eric. Great to have you here. Hopefully we'll have you do another one as well. Actually, in fact, Diane, she's still around. She's mentioned that will there be a part 2 from Eric? What do you think? Will there be a part 2 sometime?
I think we can definitely work that out for sure.
All right. So we'll look into that, Diane, in the future. Thanks very much, everybody, once again. And hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.